The silk of my wedding dress felt like armor and accusation all at once. It clung to me with the same politeness my family had trained me in for 23 years, smooth, expectant, impossible to breathe in for long. The mirror reflected what they wanted me to be, pale, composed, a woman folded into a life someone else had negotiated on my behalf. I had been practicing smiling at that mirror since I was a teenager, learning how to turn my expression into diplomacy. That night, the smile broke somewhere near the jawline and wouldn't be sewn back. Marcus had been my future in all the unromantic ways people like us counted things. His stock options fit neatly into conversations between my father and his associates. His apartment fit on realtor brochures, the way I had fit into tailored gowns. There had been dinners where the scallops were more important than the conversation, and parties where my presence validated deals. I knew his favorite wine, the names of his colleagues' children, and the precise cadence with which he apologized for needing to leave early. I had cataloged his mannerisms as if preparing an exhibit, tidy, efficient, slightly bored. What I hadn't cataloged was his capacity for betrayal. Not because people like him were incapable, of course they were capable, but because I had imagined betrayal as a dramatic rupture, something that would arrive with screaming scenes or a whispered confession across a rain-splashed paxi. Instead, it arrived in a dozen small documentary truths. An embroidered monogram on a hotel receipt slipped within the folds of a pocket, a lipstick stain on the collar of a shirt I pressed for the rehearsal dinner, a name in his phone I didn't have the courage to scroll past, until a careless night, when he left the device unlocked, and the truth presented itself like an immovable landscape. I woke up in the bridal suite with the taste of copper on my tongue and his betrayal ringing like a bell under my ribs. My mother knocked twice, once for etiquette, and once for the pretense of warmth. She walked in with the practiced smile of someone who believed that a wedding was a remedy for every discord. "Evelyn," she said, folding concern into a tone that meant, "Perform it properly." I wanted to tell her. I wanted to make her understand that what they had planned for me was not a reprieve but a cage. Instead, I watched my reflection in the dressing mirror and with the quiet efficiency I'd been taught, unhooked the veil. I remember the moment I decided to leave like a photograph gone intrusive, sharp edges of light on satin, the soft clack of heels on marble. Leaving felt like scraping frost off the inside of a car window. It was necessary, if disorienting. Rachel was waiting in the hallway, eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with the simple joy bridesmaids were supposed to feel, and everything to do with the history between us.
She had been my conspirator since childhood, the cousin who knew how to take an unflattering portrait camera and make it flattering, who had learned to smuggle snacks into our school uniforms, who understood without words that I was not built for transactional love. "You planned this," I said. "Planned?" Rachel's mouth quirked. "Honey, I planned your escape route. Don't be dramatic." She ushered me through a door reserved for staff and deliveries, the kind of door that smelled perpetually of lemon oil, and the kind of anonymity you only find in corridors where people are too busy to ask questions. The city was a blur as we drove. 7th Street dissolved into highway. My grandmother's pearls clattered in the bottom of my bag like contraband. I drove until the skyline thinned and the glassy towers gave way to the gull-scented air of the coast. Crescent Bay was the kind of town that kept its secrets in plain sight, a weathered boardwalk with an ice cream place that tasted like nostalgia, and a harbor where old men mended nets with the same slow devotion I imagined as prayer. I pulled into a motel with a neon sign that screamed retro and mediocre coffee in equal measure. The owner gave me a room with a sagging armchair and a view of a parking lot, and I paid cash like I was smuggling my future in my wallet. That first night I lay on the bed with the lights off and the dress folded on the floor. The silk muttered against itself like a small animal. My heart was a fist I couldn't smooth down. I thought of the life I had been expected to enter. Dinners with people who spoke only in quarterly returns, holidays where charity was a subject of gossip rather than compassion. I thought of Marcus, and of the way his hands had felt small when he kissed me goodbye at the rehearsal. I didn't feel righteous. I felt raw and astonishingly terrified. Freedom had edges that cut. 2 days later, hunger had chipped away at terror into practicality. I needed money, a place to sleep long term, and someone who wouldn't call my father at 3 a.m. to report that his daughter had fled. Crescent Bay had been kind to drifters and sinners in its own, unadvertised way. There were people who did not ask for proof, and proprietors who traded assistance for discretion. I wandered into Vittorio's because the neon of its sign smelled like shelter. The restaurant was dim, a place where candles burned with the kind of steady flame that suggested secrets rather than illumination. The bartender slid me soup without questions. The small table near the back was warm, as if the room itself conspired to keep me anonymous. He found me there. Of course he did. It was too neat for coincidence. And I told myself that when men like him watched, they were watching the town like a chess game they had already won. Dante Russo did not announce himself. He simply appeared as if the room had shifted to allow his presence.
He was not handsome in a way that softened edges, but in a way that made flaws more deliberate. Scar at the jaw, hands that looked like they handled heavy things, an eye that measured and cataloged a room like inventory. His suit fit him as if it were armor stitched to habits. When he spoke, his voice cornered me the way a tide corners the shore. Patient, inevitable. "You're not from around here," he said. "No," I lied. It was easier than telling the truth. Lying allowed me to be small and anonymous again, a safety I had not realized I craved. He sat across from me, despite the fact we'd both been given chairs at opposite ends of the restaurant by default. There was something deliberate in that choice that made my skin prickle. "Eat," he said. "You look like you haven't tasted salt since you were born." I ate. The food tasted like home, only nowhere near as complicated as the one I'd left. It tasted like care given without ledger. He asked me what I did. I thought about saying art history professor, the degrees that hung digitally in the cloud between me and my parents' approval. Instead, I said, I used to work in galleries. His eyes lit in a way that suggested curiosity, not surprise. "You mean you know about art," he said. "Not just objects, but about how people want to be seen." The sentence landed like a small earthquake. I had never put my expertise in such blunt terms before. To him, the idea of being seen was as practical as paying a wage. We talked until the restaurant thinned and the staff slyly began to look toward the door. He was fluent in questions that flanked rather than attacked. Conversations with him felt less like interrogations and more like negotiations. He did not ask me why I was here. He asked me what I wanted. "To get away," I said. He smiled, and the expression was a map of roads that led someplace complicated. He leaned forward and said, "Then I will make you a proposition." It was the kind of line I had seen in novels and classified as highly dangerous in real life. He outlined something modestly practical, a place to stay, money enough to breathe for a while, and a job managing the art gallery he was renovating. He did not, at first, call it by the name of its future, a place he would use for more than paintings and installations. He framed it as restoring beauty to a town that had forgotten how to notice. He said he had the resources to keep me safe. There was no oath. There was no waving of hands. There was a price implicit in his silence. Loyalty, discretion, a willingness to fit where he'd place me. He did not say in exchange for the things you see in movies. No declarations of ownership, no menacing clauses that would have gone viral if uttered in another context. But there was a tilt to his gaze that suggested the cost would not be entirely free. "I don't work for free," I said. "You'll be paid," he replied. "You'll also have a roof that people who read your family name won't find easily." It was a practical offer dressed in the language of sanctuary. I counted possibilities like coins. I thought of my father's brow creased over a ledger, of the way he'd speak of alliances, as if marriage were a swell in quarterly reports. I measured the weight of a phone call I didn't want to happen, of him calling to say my name with the tone of disappointed ownership. I measured the cost of staying, of moving back into a life that had already been mortgaged to thousands of balances. Rachel had taught me to weigh risks the way she had taught me to pick locks as a child, always with an inner map of exits and contingencies. Standing in that candlelit restaurant, fork still in my hand, I performed an arithmetic of fear. The arithmetic told me I had fewer options than I'd liked. Dante's offer made the number on the other side of the ledger appear as breathing distance. "Okay," I said. He did not celebrate. He slid across the table something like a business card, black, heavy, no letterhead, only a name, Dante Russo. The weight of the card felt like a coin in my palm, and coins buy things. He told me to show up at 9 at the building he pointed to on the harbor, and that Marco, one of his lieutenants, would be there. He used the name like it was ordinary, and I was supposed to nod as if a lieutenant was just another assistant. The way he arranged the word let me know that there were people who kept safekeeping as a trade. That night in the motel, I lay awake and rehearsed what it would mean to work for someone like him. I told myself stories to make him less frightening, that he had been softened by art, that he had a secret tenderness for artists and little girls who wanted to be seen. I told myself this because pretending gentleness could inhabit him made it less raw to go to sleep under the weight of a name I barely knew. The gallery building looked like an animal stiffened for reward, long windows like slitted eyes, a facade that suggested seafaring history, and a hint of money laundered into good design.
The interior smelled like old varnish and potential. Marco met me at the door. He was a man who carried his history on the inside of his cheek, a faint seam of a scar, a body that moved without invitation, hands that remembered hard work. "You Evelyn?" he asked. "Yes." He grunted something that could have been a greeting and led me through rooms that smelled like paint and the possibility of exhibitions. There were crates, dust, a faint hum of electricity, and the promise of light where there had been only shadow. Marco didn't ask me about my past beyond verifying that I knew how to hang a picture level and that I could write a press release without sounding like a bored academic. These were the trades that mattered to the place that would be my new home. Dante arrived later, in a way that made the air shift. He walked as if he expected the building to fall silent in respect.
He did not stand and watch long. Instead, he worked the edges, proposing a color palette for the front room, suggesting the weight of lighting that would allow shadows to be meaningful. He asked my opinion in front of Marco, which was in itself the first currency of trust. When he asked, he didn't simply request, he wanted to know how I'd shape the narrative. To be consulted felt like a gift and a tether. "You'll have the office," he told me, "and the apartment on the level above. You'll be given a budget for opening shows." I nodded because nodding was not yet commitment. I wanted to feel the walls of my new life before agreeing to shape them into anything else. But the way his eyes tracked me, careful, assessing, not predatory, conveyed something closer to permission than demand, and the permission slipped into something like relief. The apartment above the gallery was small, but meant for someone who liked light. It had a balcony that looked out over the harbor, where the ocean breathed and boats jeweled the water. The building's bones were older than the town's newest pretensions. The floors creaked with history. I made a small inventory that night, a narrow kitchen, a bathtub that would not be forgiven for budget, and a wardrobe space that could fit a dress or a life. I slept in last night's clothes because it felt disrespectful to the flight to try to dress for safety. For days I lived in a state of quasi-legal limbo. I woke and walked into the gallery and discovered that the place had a mood I wanted to befriend. People started to leave things near the entrance, anonymous donations, a box of postcards from an artist who sent melancholy landscapes, a child's painting that someone had slid under the door like a secret. I cataloged them patiently, like a paleontologist reconstructing stars. There were small initiations into Dante's world that didn't require my complicity. Once, a man in a tailored coat came into the gallery and tried to negotiate a piece of property with a menace that smelled like entitlement. He was the kind of man I might have been expected to marry, polished, hungry for gain, impatient with other people's boundaries. Dante entered quietly, and by the time he spoke, the man left with whatever dignity he had carried collapsing into a puddle of contrition. Dante's method was not to shout. It was to disassemble with a look or a sentence that rearranged someone else's priorities. Watching him was like watching someone at sea who could call the tide to shore. I learned to read the small currencies of his protection, the single envelope with cash he once left on my desk without explanation, the way Marco would call and ask my schedule with an overprotective bluntness that suggested he thought his loyalty included surveillance, the way a shadow would clear when he arrived in an event. There was no parade, there was only precision. I told myself this was necessary and practical.
Rachel called from time to time, once to ask if I'd thought about returning home, once to tell me about my mother's visits to old friends with suspiciously engaged eyebrows. "They'll find you," she said, hopeful and terrified. "They're already looking." "No," I told her. "They might look, but they don't see." The days grew into a foldable routine. I picked out artists who did not scream for attention but demanded arrival. I wrote press releases that didn't patronize modesty into exhibition statements. I learned how to hang a painting so it could breathe, and how to sit across from a donor and take payment without allowing gratitude to weigh more than fairness. Each success was a small puncture in the cage I had left, slivers of air. I also learned the cost. There was a night in late October when the wind came in like a rumor. The gallery was closed for the evening. I was painting a backroom wall a deliberate, uncontroversial white when the bell over the front door trilled. I walked out wiping my hands on a rag and found a woman who carried disdain the way others carry perfume. Valentina Castellano did not look like she belonged at Vittorio's, and yet she moved like the place had been furnished to her exact tastes. "You're the one running his little charity now," she asked. "Not a charity," I said. "A gallery." She smiled, thin, practiced, and circled me as if she were appraising the price and wondering if the tag had been lowered. I would have thought he'd picked someone with subtler taste. I didn't know what she meant by subtler taste until she laughed, and I realized she had been watching us.
that she knew Dante well enough to address what she assumed was my amateur place in the world. She said nothing more. Her laughter was a bell of warning. I felt it thread itself into the wood grain of the place, a small, insidious presence. After she left, Marco came in from the back with a bruise blooming under his eye. He brushed it off like a man who didn't want to name injury. "Accident," he said, but his jaw told a different story. When I looked at him, I felt the scrapbook of my new life flip to a page with stains that didn't dry easily. Dante arrived later, and for the first time his expression folded into something that wasn't exactitude or predatory calm. He was a man who knew how to avert a storm, and also how to let one break over him without flinching. He told me, quietly, that not everything was theater. "Some people mistake positioning for ownership," he said. "You hold your position, Evelyn. Don't mistake courage for invitation." I wanted to ask what he would do if the storm rose and drowned us, but I didn't. Instead, I painted another wall the following week, and welcomed a small, necessary crowd for an opening night that went like a series of secret prayers, people arriving with quiet generosity, an artist whose landscapes required close attention, a critic who wrote things that made me sit straighter.
The gallery, for a night, felt like a body breathing on its own. I stood at the edge of it and watched strangers applaud, and for the first time since the bridal suite mirror, I felt a portion of myself reflected back that was not arranged for public consumption. There were payments to make and judgments to render. One of the patrons who came in was the sort of man who believed the world owed him a collection. He offered money and wanted the terms attached, as though art were a commodity to be bartered. I negotiated, clumsy and surprisingly fierce. Every time I refused to bend entirely to power, Dante watched. He never intervened unless I faltered, and his interventions were precise, an arrangement of consequences that men adjust their posture. Despite the small victories, the remnants of my old life kept arriving in text messages and voicemails, the passive-aggressive echo of a family convinced that shame was a tool. My father left me a message that sounded like a business memo, details masked as concern. "We can rectify matters," he said, and the voice on the message was all calculation. Marcus's name appeared on the news one morning, tangled in a headline about a financial investigation. The article didn't name him in the way that would make my family flinch, but it was enough to remind me that the threads we cut rarely stop tugging. Dante's world was not a uniform one. It had rooms with soft light and rooms with iron in them. Once in a while, late at night when the town seemed to be inhaling, he'd come upstairs and sit on my balcony, as if the ocean provided counsel. He spoke in fragments. "You are good at making people see," he said once, looking out over the harbor. "That's valuable." "And you? What do you want to be seen as?" I asked. He considered me, and then, with a small, almost apologetic clarity, he said, "Useful." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't a vow. It was a slab of truth that neither warmed nor froze me. I put my hand on the rail and let the ocean sound like something outside the radius of our conversation. There were nights I resented him, nights I feared the shape of the bargain I'd signed in a restaurant with a heavy card in my pocket. There were nights I wanted to go back, to call my mother, to tell Marcus to keep his life because I would never be a woman who traded her existence for stock options again. The truth was that there was no going back. The door I had closed was not the sort a person opened again without seeing the fracture lines. And then one morning, a black card arrived slid under the gallery door. No flourish, just wait. I picked it up with fingers that didn't know if they were shaking from adrenaline or from cold. On the card, someone had scratched 3 words, "You're not alone." It was both a reassurance and a warning. I turned it over. Blank. The paper felt like a map I'd been given to navigate a country I hadn't yet consented to map. I realized then that leaving my wedding had not been a clean severance. It had been a pivot into another orbit. The arms I'd fallen into, the ones belonging to a man who moved through the world like a tide, were not safe in the way I had imagined safety. They were a different kind of geography, protection with a price, shelter with a storm on the horizon. I had accepted the first installment of sanctuary, but bargains are paid in installments that keep coming due. The first time Valentina's name came up directly, Marco was the one to tell me. He slid a thin folder across my desk one afternoon, and inside there were photographs of a woman in a dress, of a hand reaching for a painting the way someone would claim the last piece of land on a board. "She used to be involved," Marco said. "She's territorial." "Territory is not the same as love," I replied, because I felt the need to say it aloud. Everything about my life had become a negotiation of definitions. He nodded. "Some people don't care about definitions." I filed it away like any other italicized note in the ledger of my life, but I couldn't help tracing the edges of the black card with my thumb and wondering how long before some currencies devalued me. The winter came in a slow, salt-stung way, and with it a drift of small incidents that suggested the town was a place where stories adhered like barnacles. A tire slashed, Marco's, not mine. An unknown caller left static on the phone. A crate meant for a show arrived with its seal broken, but nothing stole. Each nuisance was a fingerprint of other people's warfare. None of them required that I wade into the details. What they did require was presence, an ability to stand between art and harm, between the shape of something fragile and the bluntness of force. Once, when I went home to the apartment in the early hours, there was a single red rose on the doormat. No note, no signature. The petals were immaculate and damp from the ocean air. I held it and felt an odd domestic urge to place it in a vase. It remained there for days, drying at the edges like a memory that refuses to leave quietly. It could have been a romantic gesture from someone who adored me from afar. It could have been a ceremonial claim. It could have been any number of things. I learned to treat ambiguity as a weather forecast. Rachel watched me shift into this life with a mixture of pride and worry. She came up one afternoon with a battered suitcase and sat on the floor of the gallery office like a refugee and a blessing. "You're occupying space I didn't think you could," she said, "and you're making people come." "That's because I'm choosing the art," I said, and it was true. Choosing art felt like choosing the people you wanted in your life. It felt like fidelity to imagination rather than codes. We drank coffee and plotted small future shows, as if small plans could fortify us against what's larger.
She asked me whether Dante was more dangerous than his reputation suggested, and I told her what I had learned, that danger lived in economies, some economic, some of loyalty. "He's not a fairy godfather," I said. "He's someone with standards and a way of ensuring those standards are met." "You mean he uses violence?" she said. The accusation was soft and final. People like her used the word the way a surgeon used a scalpel, precise and unavoidable. "I mean he has people who make sure things remain tidy," I replied, "and tidy can become a kind of quiet violence." Rachel looked at me and smiled sadly. "That's still a kind of protection," she said. "Not necessarily good, not necessarily right." There was a truth in that I could not deny. Protection does not erase compulsion. Shelter is not the same thing as consent. The line between being saved and being owned bent sometimes, and I found myself measuring whether my presence here was co-authorship or acquiescence. The gallery began to thrive in modest, stubborn ways. The town liked having its own cultural signal. The opening nights were smaller than the ones I had attended as someone else's accessory, but they felt authentic. I found myself growing into my decisions the way a plant grows toward light. Each day I checked my hands for dirt, literal and metaphorical, and began to see myself less as a fugitive and more as a person who had deliberately chosen an improbable life. It was not a life without fear. Sometimes, when the harbor turned black and the moon looked like a spare coin, I would stand on the balcony and think about the bridal bouquet left on the hotel dresser, the ghost of a life folded in tissue paper. I would open drawers I had not yet used and find ghost receipts, a matchbook from a restaurant in a city I had not visited in months. Freedom had its own debts. And yet, for the first time since the mirror with its appointed smile, I was making marks on a blank wall. It was messy. It was dangerous. It was mine in the exact way that complicated bargains are, full of beautiful things and also full of hard choices. When Marco found me at closing one night, he didn't look like a man who had come to gossip. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, and for a second I thought he might be about to reproach me. Instead, he handed me a small envelope with no return address. "He left this at the front," Marco said. Inside was a photograph of me in the wedding dress. Not a flattering shot, taken somewhere I had not known I'd been photographed, with the veil hanging like a guilty cloud behind me. On the back, in ink that looked like Dante's, 2 words, "Choose well." I carried that photograph home and sat with it on the kitchen counter while the ocean whispered outside. Choose well. The imperative held as many weights as it did hopes. I speculated wildly about his intention. Was it a warning, a benediction, a test? And in the end, there was no answer except my own assessment. I had fled a life where people negotiated me like a line item. In its place, I had entered a territory ruled by a man who kept his books in flesh and silence. The translations of protection and possession would not be easy. They would require sentences I hadn't yet learned to pronounce. The gallery needed an opening show. I found artists who spoke in small languages and invited them into the space.
We drank cheap whiskey and poor coffee and celebrated like people who had nothing to lose, which is precisely the kind of gratitude that tastes most like liberty. The opening night was a horizon. People came, they praised, they purchased modest works, and I felt my shoulders relax into the shape of belonging. And then, at the end of the night, as the last of the guests bled out into the dark streets with polite goodbyes, a car idled for a moment at the curb. A man stepped out. Not Marco, not a member of the staff, but Dante himself. He crossed the street with the gait of someone who had been walking the invisible lines of people for years. He stopped at the door and looked at me with an expression that made everything inside me fall both into place and into question. He did not need to ask how the evening had gone. He knew. He only reached into his pocket and handed me a small thing, another black card. "Keep this," he said. "Not everyone will understand why you did what you did." I looked at him and then at the card. My life had split into before and after, and the cards with the punctuation marks he used to remind me of both. I wanted to ask whether protection could be renegotiated, whether I could ever be so far from being owned that only my choices defined me. I wanted to ask 100 practical and unromantic questions. I did not, though. Instead, I tucked the card into my wallet beside the photograph and said, "Thank you." He smiled in a way that said his gratitude was a ledger, not an emotion. "For what it's worth," he said, "you chose something promising." I had chosen to run from a wedding. I had chosen to accept the hand of a man whose world thrummed with danger. The choices were not tidy, they were not clean, but they were, for the first time in a long time, mine. When I turned out the lights and the gallery exhaled into darkness, I held the photograph of the dress in my hands and read the words on the back again. "Choose well." Outside, the harbor shimmered, and the town whispered in a dialect I was still learning to understand. The night closed around the building like a curtain, and I felt, with a strange, hollow pleasure, the weight of a life I had refused to stay in, and the surprising gravity of a life I had stepped toward. The rest, as the saying goes, would have to be learned on the job. If you like tense, character-driven romances, stay with me for a while. After I tucked the photograph and black card into my wallet, life settled into a pattern that felt at once domestic and precarious. The gallery became the slow, steady work of an organism finding its rhythm, coaxing light into corners, arguing with plumbers, learning the exact hitch of the town's gossip. I learned who liked to buy other people's loneliness and who preferred to give it away for nothing. I learned which donors used their checkbooks to locate weaknesses and which ones wrote checks that came unstained by expectation. I learned to keep my own pulse steady when men in tailored coats stopped by and expected deference. I learned to say no with a voice that didn't hope for applause. Rachel stayed longer than I'd expected. She opened a small cafe down the block, a place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that advertised sincerity more than profits. If I had been asked to design the town's emotional center, I would have put Rachel's cafe in its heart. We traded updates over bad coffee and better pastry, and she offered the kind of counsel that made space for both fierce decisions and public missteps. When my parents called, their voices honeyed, then sharp, then mendacious, Rachel answered the messages I didn't want to. She read to me a text my father had left like it was a litany. "Evelyn, rectify this. Evelyn, think of reputation. Evelyn, come home." She read it without pity, because pity makes people smaller. Instead, she said, "You did what you had to. That counts." I kept saving the black cards Dante left me, little formalities with too much meaning, and I began to use them as bookmarks in my days. The words on the back of the photograph, "Choose well," appeared in the corners of my mind like a small compass that sometimes pointed true and sometimes spun like a carnival wheel. I asked myself less often whether I'd made the right decision, and more often whether I had the courage to own the consequences of it. Ownership was becoming its own kind of freedom. Valentina's presence grew like mold on a damped wall, slow, invasive, hard to eradicate. Her first public affront had been a smile that cut through the gallery like an accusation. Later, she escalated into more visible acts. There was a night when she arrived uninvited to a fundraiser and let a rumor leak softly into the crowd, something about the provenance of one of Dante's pieces, uttered with enough insinuation that donors looked at their invitations like they might be counterfeit. Another time, during a quieter afternoon, she left a critique of one of my chosen artists in a local blog, not anonymous, but barely signed, a dagger disguised as aesthetic opinion. Each act was calibrated to be humiliating, never illegal, never violent, small crimes of the social world that left me both exposed and furious. Sometimes I thought her jealousy was about Dante. Other times I thought it was simply about territory.
There were hints, faces, old photographs that suggested she had once lived inside Dante's orbit, that the story was longer than my arrival.
Marco, the man who moved through loyalty like a second skin, told me what he could without becoming my archivist. He had a way of sketching people's histories that left the worst parts unspoken. She was close to him once, he said, like someone stating a weather fact. Close enough to be dangerous. That word, dangerous, followed me for weeks. I watched for the signs of danger and tried not to practice my own paranoia. I learned to lock doors with deliberate hands, to check the back alley at night, to change when I left for errands so that there was no pattern to exploit. I learned to let Marco call me during the day with check-ins that sounded like surveillance and comfort fused. I learned to accept help the way a sailor accepts a rope, without asking too many questions about where it had been. Then came a morning that rearranged everything. I had been up early, cataloging works for an upcoming show, a series of seascapes with invisible horizons, when Marco dropped a thin envelope on my desk. Inside was an invitation, an olive ink note from a man I'd seen only in photographs and newsprint, the patriarch of the Castellano family. He wanted to meet Dante to discuss formalities. The language was immaculate and designed to convey civility where none existed. Beneath the civility was the scent of a truce. Dante asked me to come. He insisted. "It will be cleaner if you're there," he said, and when he said it, he meant more than manners. He drove us to a neutral place outside the town, a hotel lobby with minimal art and a staff trained in omission. We waited under glass chandeliers that felt like obsolete sea creatures, and I watched Dante watch the room, hands folded, jaw tight enough to show the scar under the skin. He was a man who could make rooms obey his schedule, a man who wore patience like armor and danger like a pocket knife. The Castellanos arrived with their own kind of choreography, an elder who practiced civility the way some people practice prayer, a son whose smile did not reach his eyes, and Valentina, more composed than I'd ever seen, the lines around her mouth a map of work done and victories lost. The meeting began with paper and talk, the sort of civility that tried to pretend the world wasn't a ledger of favors and debts. Men moved language like chess pieces, apologies polished, histories reworded, intentions at once vague and exact. We exchanged small courtesies. I sat between Marco and Dante. My knees felt like they were supporting not just me but an entire table of unspoken things. I tried to keep my face neutral, practice the look of someone who belonged in curated space. I heard Marco shift his weight, and in that half second, felt more than I should have felt, a premonition of wrongness that didn't need to explain itself. The sequence that followed was not cinematic in the way stories promised. It was blunt and sewn to the bone of reality. There was a sound, sudden, metallic, that came from the corridor.
Doors that had been orderly burst into motion. It was not the precise violence I had imagined when I had watched films late at night. It was less choreographed and more weathered, men moving like people in reduced lighting, hands finding bodies in the way of someone searching for a pulse. The Castellanos were not alone. Voices rose, and the hotel's calm became brittle. What happened next happened with the kind of clarity that refuses later embellishment. I remember the angle of Dante's head as he turned, the way his neck kissed the line of his collarbone, and then the sharp, adult sound of collapse. Marco lunged across the table, and in a second the room became a tangle of bodies and shouts and the mechanical clatter of an old hotel's security shutters. I don't know the number of steps between the first shout and the moment Dante hit the floor. My brain compressed them into a single breath of time. They had shot him. There is a certain quality to the air in a place after a bullet finds flesh. It thickens, becomes granular, like snow melting in oil. Sound focuses into the single note of someone making a hole in the world. Dante's hand closed, then opened, his breath shallow and uneven. Blood was a red punctuation across the beige of the hotel's carpet. I can be clinical in crisis if I choose, the way a surgeon can be cold to the wound. I told myself to be practical, find someone to call an ambulance, take his pulse, keep him breathing. Practicality turned into prayer without the language, into a ridiculous list of steps that felt both trivial and essential. Marco's face, open, taut, furious, became the map of what's left when loyalty is raw. He shifted from protector to something else entirely, a man with a task that had become a torment. We got him in an ambulance. The ride to the hospital was a vacuum where Dante's shallow breaths filled too much space.
The siren's wail was a thin thing that couldn't hold meaning. The city slid by in a blur of late daylight, while I held his hand and watched it go cold under my palm. He was heavy in a way I hadn't been prepared for. He was a body that, despite everything, contained a history that had threaded into mine. At the hospital, faces rearranged themselves into roles. Nurses asked questions and clipped voices. Machines measured things I'd never thought to measure. The doctors moved like people translating a foreign language. I waited, because waiting was the only physical action there was left for me. Waiting became its own ritual, pulling at the seam of my new life to see whether it would unravel. In those hours, the gallery blurred into a memory. The black cards, the photographs, the small domestic rituals that had anchored me, each receded like objects at low tide. I found myself cataloging moments of Dante's small mercies, the way he had once left an envelope on my desk, the way he had consulted me on the gallery's palette, the way he had handed me the black card with a weight that felt like both coin and shackle. I thought of Marco, of his bruised hands and quiet loyalty. I thought of Rachel in her cafe, of my parents polishing their moral outrage. The prognosis was uncertain. The doctors spoke in the grammar of conditionals, could be, might be. They guarded the truth like men with maps to a territory they did not want to overexpose. With each update, my stomach folded and unfolded. I had come to expect danger in ways that felt almost theatrical. This was not theater. This was a man I had let live close enough to hold my future in the shadow of his decisions, and now decisions were being taken for him in sterile rooms whose blinds stitched the light into squares. When the surgeon finally came out, his face wore the kind of expression that cannot decide whether to soften or harden. "He's stable for now," he said. The words sounded like something generous and exact at once. Later, in the quiet that follows, someone will tell me that he was nearly gone, that he'd bled too much, that he had been lucky. In the first unbearable hours, luck seemed like a man with a face I had not yet met. When I was allowed to see him, he was a person with tubes and the sheen of hospital skin. His eyes fluttered like something trying to remember weight. I sat by his bed and watched for any sign of recognition. For a long time there was only shallow breath and the small machinery of survival. Then his fingers twitched and found mine, the same fingers that could be hard and exacting, and the same fingers that had brushed the album photograph of my wedding dress, where the word "choose well" stood like a small directive. "You're bleeding," he whispered at some point, less a statement than an observation. His voice was cavernous from the tubes and the operation. I laughed then, softly, because it was absurd, a man like Dante remarking on the ordinary fact of blood. "Yeah," I said, "we both are." He blinked slowly, as if choosing what to say. "You shouldn't be here," was his first full sentence, an odd reprimand that landed like a pedal. "You should be safe, not in a hospital." I wanted to tell him that he had never promised me safety. I wanted to tell him that safety had been a word my family had used to bind me. Instead, I said nothing. My silence was an impossible length of language. Later, in a voice that was almost stolen from himself, he said, "I wanted you to be far from this. I didn't know how to make it so." I saw then that his life had been a series of attempts to purchase absence for those he cared about. Walls, money, men. Protection was the currency he knew how to spend most fluently. But protection had a cost, and someone always paid.
Marco's jaw tightened as he stood by the door, a man reconfigured to the shape of grief in progress. He didn't speak much. When a man like Marco is pulled taut, the few words he gives are like flint. I kept vigil in the waiting room between shifts, talking to nurses, to anyone who would let me be near the thin corridor that gave on to Dante's room. Time in hospitals has a viscosity. Minutes are long, days flatten. I slept in a chair and woke with a taste of antiseptic in my mouth. The hours gave me space to think of other things, Marcus's arrest, the black cards, my parents' messages, but they kept folding back to Dante, to the shape he cut in my days. When he finally woke enough to talk, there was something confessional in his tone that stripped away the careful inventory he usually kept. It was as if being faced with death had rearranged the ledger he used to keep people and things. "I thought about buying you a bigger life," he said, the sentence unadorned and earnest in a way I wasn't accustomed to hearing. "But I realized I didn't want to buy you anything. I wanted you to choose me." It was not an offer of ownership. It was a clumsy, vulnerable plea, mapped in a man whose habits were to give orders rather than ask.
I heard in it the truth I had been avoiding, that behind his protective measures was a loneliness that could be lessened only by another presence choosing to remain. He looked at me then, with a steadiness that had nothing to do with threat. "Stay," he said simply, "because you want to." He did not ask me to pledge my life to him as payment for protection. He did not speak in claims and tags. He spoke in the grammar of want. That was the honest cruelty of it. He wanted me in a world that would always be compromised by the methods he used to guard it. To stay would mean to accept a scenery where safety were a dangerous face. I had time in the quiet between his surgeries and the sterile conversations to think. I had time to remember the mirror in the bridal suite, to replay the image of my father's calloused hands closing like a drawer. I thought about the difference between being sheltered and being owned. I thought about the gallery, a small island of art and argument, a space I had carved out by making choices that didn't involve other people's ledgers. I realized then that my life could not be reduced to the shelter he offered, if that shelter required me to vanish into the background of his decisions. My autonomy mattered. When I spoke, my voice was the kind of thing that had been hardened by months of fierce practice. "I will stay," I said. "Not because I need you to save me. Not because I want to be protected like a piece on a shelf. I'll stay because I choose the life that exists beside yours, because I built something here that I will not hand over, and because—" I stopped, because the sentence was larger than any of us had a right to finish in that room.
His hand squeezed mine, and there was a look on his face that belonged to a man who had been given permission he didn't think he deserved. "That's the only way to be with someone," he said. The days after remained heavy with consequence. The Castellanos' power did not evaporate in a single bullet wound. Valentina's presence grew colder in the press and hotter in the whispers. The town's paper ran an uncertain column about feuds and business disputes, which in Crescent Bay read as a polite euphemism for the fact that a mafia faction had attempted to make a point. The police asked questions in neutral tones and then closed them into files. Dante's recovery took weeks, and each day added a new stitch to his person, a limp that would not be a limp forever, but would be the first scar that didn't map to his face. There were public consequences for me, too. My father's messages turned from honey to frost. A recorded voicemail played once like a threat dressed as parental concern. "Evelyn, you're making mistakes. Do not expect your mother or me to be your salvation if you insist on these choices." My mother sent me an email quoting scripture and statistics, the sort of thing that measured moral failure like an account. I deleted it. Then I framed a photograph of Rachel's laugh and put it on my desk to remind myself of the people who had chosen to stay in my life for reasons other than advantage. Marcus's name lived in the margins. News articles about investigations, subpoenas, financial regulators poring over ledgers. I received a text one gray morning that was a screenshot of a headline, "Investment banker under investigation." The text came from an unknown number. I didn't reply. There was a complicated sense of liberation in his downfall. It didn't erase the past. It only made the ledger public. My father called once after a front-page story, and then never again. The silence was as loud as the voice disowns I had expected. Valentina receded from physical confrontation into legal aggression and social assault. There were letters from attorneys, polite, threatening drafts that tried to frame the narrative so that Dante looked like a man without remorse, and I like a woman who had misinterpreted hospitality. Threats are strange things. They try to shape you without touching you, like the gust of a passing car designed to unsettle your hair. They rarely end anything. They only reframe the stakes. During Dante's recovery, I did what I had learned to do. I worked. The gallery needed a winter show, and art kept being stubbornly disinterested in the sort of fear that wanted tidy endings. Artists sent pieces that felt like arguments rather than apologies. I took them in, curated with a deliberate hand, and in doing so, I stitched my days back together. The work was a salve and a stake. It reminded me that I had a practice that the world respected on its own terms. Marcus stayed even closer.
He was a man of few words but infinite small gestures, a repaired stair, a new lock, the way he always left a spare cup of coffee at a table for me. There were nights when I would find him on the gallery couch, asleep with a newsprint folded over his chest like a blanket. Once, during a lull, we spoke about his past, what he had been before he became the person who guarded others' lives. "I used to fish," he said, as if introducing himself anew. "My brother taught me. We were kids then. We thought the ocean was our whole world. He scratched at the stubble on his jaw and then laughed, the sound a paper cut. He drowned when we were young. I swore I'd never be caught off guard again. There was nothing theatrical in his confession. It was a human fact that explained why a man might carry such tightness in his chest. I listened, and in return offered him small confidences, my fears about art selling out, my shame about the dress, the way my parents' voices still threaded through my sleep. We were two people in different registers, both learning to live without the exact protections we'd assumed we'd have. There came a day when Valentina made the mistake of pushing too close in public. She arrived at an event the gallery hosted with a companion and a smile like a blade. She walked through the crowd and, calculated, theatrical, placed herself in the center and spoke into the room about what happens when power hires culture as camouflage. Her words landed like pebbles, some harmless, some aimed to bruise. She implied, without legal claim, that the gallery was a laundering ground for favors. The room shifted. A donor left. A journalist wrote notes. Dante handled it in the only way he knew, quietly, precisely. He called a meeting with the staff of a nearby business and arranged a small patron dinner that included the man who had left and his friends. In 2 days he had replaced hurt with new gifts and had arranged a small ceremony, the sort of social sleight of hand that smoothed edges. It was effective, and it emphasized the truth about his world. Resources could bulldoze embarrassment. The problem was that bulldozing comes with collateral, an eroded landscape where people forget to notice the cost. I grew more comfortable with the idea that the life I had chosen would be messy. The moral clarity I had hoped for when I left the bridal suite was a child's painting of the world. The adult world offered an uneasy palette of choices, and I found myself learning to paint with shades of gray. I found new friends in people who had also been tripped by life and decided to create rather than surrender. The gallery became a node in a network of people who didn't require me to be small. Winter softened into spring with the patient quality of a town that knew how to wait. I prepared for an opening that would feel like a test, a show of local artists, a night when the town's eyes would turn inward, and maybe, if we were lucky, see what we had made.
I planned the lighting, the order of the pieces, the way the wine would be poured into cups that didn't have names. The night was a horizon I'd been steering toward for months. The opening went well. People came, some with pictures of their grandparents, some with empty hands. The room held breath and then exhaled in laughter. The audience had arrived. Dante arrived near the end, late as always, but when he did enter, the room folded around him. He did not make a scene. He stepped to the back and watched. I saw him from across the room, and the sight of him was like seeing a tide that had learned to be polite. He came to me later and put another black card on my desk, with 2 words written on the back in his precise hand. "You're mine." The card belonged to him like every other gesture, ambiguous, heavy, freighted with the kind of meaning he never explained. I held it in my hand and felt the old echo of ownership that had followed my life like a shadow. In the quiet of the back room, I turned it over in my fingers and then quoted the words back to him, soft and incredulous. "You're mine," I said, tasting the sentence like a thought I didn't want to embalm. He watched my face carefully. "Not in the way you fear," he said, "in the way someone says, 'You matter to me,' in the way I would stop the world for you." There it was, the same plea he'd made in the hospital, small and human, uttered with less blood on his hands but with the same gravitational pull. I thought about my choice and the small armies of consequence it had raised. I thought too about the way the gallery had grown, the artists who had entrusted their work to me, the friends who had risked small acts of faith. I thought about the photograph in my wallet and the phrase "choose well." I decided to answer him honestly. "You can't make me yours by threatening me," I said. "You can be mine only if I choose you." He smiled, and in his eyes I saw a person who had kept too many things in secret pockets and now had to learn to air them out. "Then choose me," he said, the sentence the simplest form of desire. "Stay by me because you want to, not because you can't be anywhere else." I stayed. The months after the opening were quieter in some ways and more complicated in others. Valentina's presence diminished from public spectacle to rumor and then to ambiguity. She moved, I later heard, to a city where pedigrees shift and new empires rise. The Castellano family retreated from immediate confrontation and focused on reforms, or the appearance of them, and the town found its equilibrium again. The press wrote pieces about the romance of power
as if any romance could ever be tidy. Dante healed. He carried scars, inside and out. His movements had hesitation I recognized as the remapping of a man learning his body was mortal.
We learned to live with the remap together. Dinners in the apartment where we shared stories of small banalities, his hand on the back of my neck when I needed to remember my breath, my hand on his when he wanted to be reminded of something softer than command. It wasn't always tender. He was still a man who made decisions with little fanfare and expected the world to respond. But he also learned to ask permission where before he had assumed compliance. The change was not perfect, but it was real enough that I noticed it and that it mattered. There were days I still thought of the bridal suite, of the mirror with its rehearsed smile. Sometimes when the wind made the curtains in my apartment move like breath, I would catch the whisper of silk and imagine the gown folded in a drawer somewhere. I never returned it. I kept it as an artifact, a reminder of the person who had been and the one who had chosen differently. Rachel's cafe prospered. She kept the same mismatched chairs and added a back garden with a string of lights. Marco took a small house near the harbor where he kept a boat he would sometimes take out at dawn. He taught me how to breathe when the water was hard and in pieces. We became, in our rough way, a family not built on genealogical lines, but on mutual choice. The gallery continued to be the center of my days. People started to trust the space. Artists from cities I had only visited on business cards began to submit work. Each piece sold felt like a testimony to the life I'd conjured with my own small hands. There were still costs. I received a final voicemail from my father that contained the sting of disinheritance and a thin apology that was immediately retracted. My mother never visited the gallery. Family dinners would never be mine again, and in some ways I grieved that severance, the way one grieves the end of a relationship with a version of oneself. But grief, too, was a form of owning what I'd chosen to lose. The gallery's next opening was a larger affair, a retrospective of local artists who had defined Crescent Bay's visual language. The night was humid, the harbor catching the lights and splintering them into glitter. People moved through the space like a congregation of small mercies. I stood at the edge of a room and watched the faces of those who had come, friends, patrons, artists, a few men who still thought power meant getting what you want. Dante found me midway through the evening and slid his hand in mine without making it an event. It felt like a private treaty. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the lights had softened to a postscript, I sat on the back steps with Dante and we watched the harbor breathe. He had a cigarette between his fingers, a habit he had not yet given up, and I had a cup of lukewarm coffee. The harbor's lights reflected on the water like a constellation. "You ever think about going back?" he asked. I considered the question. Going back was a closed door with a puddle of my former life leaking into it. The life I'd built here was incomplete and dangerous, and mine. Sometimes, I said, but the thing about going back is that you can't unlearn what you've already learned. I know what a ledger looks like now. I can see when people count me as a line item. He was silent for a long moment, and the sound between us was the same as prayer, a pause big enough to hold consequence. "I wanted to keep you away from that," he said, half to himself, "but I'd rather you be with me by choice than absent because I made you safe." "That is the kind of thing lovers should say," I said, "not buyers." He laughed, and the sound was lighter than I'd heard it in months. "I'm learning." That was the hum of our life together, a series of small lessons that didn't erase past harm, but tried to create a daily ethic that could be lived in public. We were not heroes. We were people trying to stitch together a life under complicated circumstances. Time does something to wounds. It hardens them in places and softens them in others. By the time the next winter came, the gallery had become a place that people associated with more than my name. It had outgrown me in gentle ways. There were nights when that frightened me. The thought that something I had birthed with such small, fierce work could, like any living thing, continue beyond me. But I wanted that. I wanted something that would outlive the tenuousness of my choices. Valentina faded into the background as new headlines caught the town's attention. The Castellano family retreated to its private affairs. Rumors about the reach of power changed shape, and in time lessened in urgency. The townspeople returned to their routines, and the harbor regained the rhythm of patience. When I passed a newsstand, a small column would occasionally refer to the anniversary of events that had once reshaped our lives. The words were dry now, the violence of those days curated into pages for readers who prefer tidy summaries. Still, the lessons of the past remained. We all learned how to be vigilant without letting vigilance eat the marrow of our days. We learned to practice a kind of cautious generosity, the kind that kept people's freedoms intact while acknowledging the complexity of the world we inhabited. One afternoon, months after the worst of it, I found an envelope under my door. Inside was a small note on heavy paper. No black card this time, just handwriting I had learned to recognize even when it was not present. He wrote in a few unadorned lines, "I was wrong about a lot of things. I'm trying to be better. Stay with me, not as a thing I own, but as a life we choose together." I read it, and then, privately, I folded it and put it on top of the photograph of the wedding dress. Choose well, the margin still reminded me. This time, choosing felt less like a plunge and more like a cultivated decision. I could see clearly the trade-offs, the textures of the life I inhabited, and the things I loved that were not stolen from me. The gallery's next opening was planned as a celebration and a reckoning. We invited artists who took risks and people who had learned to love the town despite, or perhaps because of, its history. The night was full of small triumphs. A young artist sold her first print, a critic wrote something that didn't try to explain us away, and a woman who had once left the town returned and apologized without theatrics. We did not hold our breath for complete reconciliations. Life does not do that. We aimed instead for the modest miracle of coherence. The final scene came not with fireworks, but with an unremarkable kind of beauty. The gallery's opening was late. The harbor was a dark smear outside. We stood at the edge of the crowd, Dante in his careful jacket, me in a dress that was not a wedding dress, but a dress I had chosen for myself, and watched people move through the space. At a moment that felt like the end of many small stories, anyone could have said anything, a confession, a vow, a whispered secret. Instead, Dante turned and took my hand in a way that was both ordinary and intimate. "You ran from your wedding into my arms," he said quietly, not as accusation, but as a fact. I looked at him, the scar, the soft hands, the look he reserved for things he did not want to break, and felt the shape of that truth settle. "I did," I said, "and I chose to stay." He smiled then, the kind of smile that had once been leisure and now had become something else. "I'm glad," he said. "For what it's worth, I'm glad." I didn't say that I was glad in a simple way. I said I was grateful for the choices I'd made and for the life I had built. I understood finally that freedom isn't always the absence of protection, and protection isn't always the absence of freedom. They could exist in tension if both people chose it. They could be terrible if one person insisted on ownership. We stood there, hands linked, the gallery behind us full of light and noise and the present. The ocean beyond hummed like an old instrument tuning itself. I thought of the silk of the wedding dress, of the mirror, of the envelope with "Choose well" tucked into the photograph. I thought of how small acts, choosing a painting, opening a door, refusing a narrative, had shaped the life I had now. Days later, there was an article in a magazine that tried to make the story tidy. It failed, of course. Our lives are not neat narratives. They are messy, contradictory, and stubbornly human. The article called Dante a local magnate and called me an ex-runaway. They quoted lines we didn't say and left out the parts that mattered most. I read it over coffee with Rachel, who laughed until it hurt. "Let them have their headlines," she said. "We know the real work." The gallery continued.
The cards continued to come sometimes, less as claims and more as notes. Small debts settled, small courtesies extended. I kept them in a drawer I opened when I needed reminders about what choices had cost and what they had given. Marco visited the gallery not as a sentinel, but as a friend, who sometimes left squid ink on his fingers that didn't wash off all the way. He fished on weekends and sometimes woke us with early morning coffee because he liked the shape of the day before the town found its voice. I became known in Crescent Bay as a manager of art and a woman who had chosen differently. Children sometimes came in and asked for stories.
Occasionally, I told them about colors and tides and the way certain paintings need to be hung high. No one asked me about the negotiation that had brought me here. People prefer simplicity. They prefer their heroes flat. I gave them none of that. I gave them instead the truth of a life that tried to balance danger and agency. There were nights when fear returned like an uninvited tide, pulling at the hem of things. A car idling outside the gallery, a strange phone call, a rumor gone viral. Each time the muscles tightened and then relaxed as we addressed them. We learned to live with the tension between being seen and being safe. In the quiet hours, when the gallery's lights were low and the city hummed against the glass, I would sometimes touch the edge of the photograph of the wedding dress. It was no longer a thing that accused me. It was an artifact of an earlier life, and a marker of the path I'd chosen. The silk in memory had transformed from cage into fabric that I now understood could carry both the imprint of something old and the possibility of repair. If I had to put this story into a single sentence, it would be imprecise. I ran from my wedding and into the arms of a man whose world was dangerous, and in the space between fear and choice, I found a life that was mine. The sentence misses everything. The cost, the small victories, the nights of tears, the mornings of coffee, the way the town watched and then turned back to its own business. But it holds one remnant of truth, that agency matters more than protection offered without consent, and that love, when it exists, must be chosen. I do not know what the future will hold. Valentina's fate remains a rumor whispered by someone with an agenda. Laws may change, headlines will shift, power dynamics will realign. Dante and I will continue to navigate a life that looks like a kind of truce between danger and tenderness. There will be days I regret elements of the bargain, and there will be days I know I made the right choice. On the night I finally closed the gallery for the last time before a long trip, packing up a show to move it to a city where someone else might love it, I stood on the balcony and let the ocean sound drape over me. The wind smelled like returning things, salt, old paper, a promise that was not a guarantee.
Dante came out and stood beside me, quiet and solid. He did not reach for the photograph or the black cards. He reached for my hand and held it the way a person holds another's hand when they both know what they've sacrificed and what they've kept. "Are you happy?" he asked, as if asking for permission to be part of my answer. I smiled at him, at the scar and the soft mouth, at the man who had once been an arrangement and had become something I had chosen. "Yes," I said, "but not the easy kind, the kind that takes work." He squeezed my hand. "I'll do the work," he said. We did not need vows to bind us. We needed choices and the daily labor of being transparent about the cost of our protection, of offering consent rather than command. We had both learned to ask and to listen. That was, in the end, the truest kind of intimacy. I had run from a life designed for me and stepped into another life shaped by a man who used protection as currency. It had been messy and dangerous and sometimes terrifying. It had also been an unspooling, dangerous education in what it meant to own one's decisions. I had been given shelter, and I had negotiated fiercely for the freedom to remain myself within it. As the harbor breathed below and the town turned its small lamps on, I tucked the little black card into my back pocket. No threat today, just an object that had become part of our vocabulary. I pressed the photograph of my wedding dress to my palm and then set it gently on the windowsill, where the moonlight could make it look like nothing more than fabric folded into memory. When the night finally closed and the ocean hummed like a machine that had found its rhythm, I whispered to whoever the dark would answer, "I am here." Not because I was saved from my past by force, but because I chose to build a life in the same room as danger, choosing every day to keep my autonomy. If this story moved you, consider subscribing or sharing it with someone who loves tangled, true romances.